And then we'll start. All right, so we are underway. Ahmer, we are thankful for your being here from University of Washington. The University School visited there. I think you saw in some pictures years ago on an upper school trip when the cherry trees were blooming and blossoming, and it was lovely. And we appreciate your sharing your time with us today. I'm going to turn it over to you now. Thank you.
Thanks. But Jason, before I get going, just want to double check. Can you see my screen? I've shared it now.
Yes, everyone sees your PowerPoint, yes, or your presentation. Yep, thank you.
All right. And can you also see me?
Yes, you guys should all be able to see. Yes, perfect.
All right, perfect. Thanks. All right, so, good afternoon / evening, everyone. Thank you for having me here. My name is Ahmer, and today I just want to have a conversation with you all about mis and disinformation in online settings. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take about 15 minutes to put some things on the table for us to get a discussion going, but I've reserved the rest of the time for answering questions. And I went with a Q&A format, for one, because I don't know what you all are curious about. So this will just allow us to be more interactive and adaptable. And also because, well, for selfish reasons, I'm fasting. It's the month of Ramadan, so I'm not allowed to drink water, and I also have a slightly sore throat. So, kind of just being strategic about how much talking I have to do there. All right, so I'll say a bit more about myself. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Washington, and next fall, I'm going to be a professor of information at the University of Texas at Austin. And outside school, I've had the good fortune to work with several large organizations like the World Bank, the UN, Yahoo, and Facebook. My research looks at how people currently use social media during crisis events. Specifically, for 6 years, I've examined how rumors spread on social media during events like hostage situations, terrorist attacks, and plane hijackings and crashes. I've also looked at how crisis events like the ones I just mentioned can be opportunistically exploited by coordinated efforts to manipulate people. And I've explored how you might confront these coordinated efforts with more solidarity as citizens, as educators, and technology designers. I also want to share 3 things about myself that show up in all of this work to different degrees. First, I bring a particular cultural understanding to my work. I've lived in Pakistan for 28 years and come of age under a military dictatorship. And that's helped me really appreciate, I think, what it's like to exist in a society that has a deeply dysfunctional relationship with institutions like academia, the government, and journalism, and where conspiracy theorizing has become both a means of coping with and maintaining the status quo. I've also seen people migrate towards extremist positions. And this helps me understand how alienation, social alienation, can motivate a person to develop a very different position on what even counts as valid or correct knowledge, and use that to find inconsistencies in news coverage. And this guides my imagination whenever I think about what accurate information or critical thinking even is, right? When our technologies expose us to our differences, our moral differences and differences in political values and how we make sense of the world. And last but not least, I see my work and myself, I think, as the product of a broad education. I've studied human-centered design at the PhD level. But before that, I received a liberal arts education, one that combined a training in computer science with a deep love of English literature and the humanities. So my work usually draws on a lot of different techniques and disciplines and perspectives. All right, so my overriding goal today is to help add nuance to our understanding of mis and disinformation in online settings. So I'll define some terms and situate them in some historical context. And then I'll really quickly, highlight 4 misconceptions about disinformation that my research is helping to undo. I'm sharing these as provocations for questions, But I'd also like you to just listen for these because in my experience, they're surprisingly common and leave many decision makers vulnerable to manipulation online. And spoiler alert, I'm going to name them for you up front. They are that disinformation is a binary or black and white problem, that it's mostly propagated by bots and trolls, that its aim is to convince people to hold a particular position or ideology, and my favorite one, that it only works on other people, right? Not you, just other people. All right, so let's start unpacking all this by laying down some terms. You know, over the last couple of years, we've all been introduced to a variety of words to describe some of the toxicities in our information environment. And in the interest of helping you listen, I'm going to focus on a subsection of this problem and on one of these terms in particular, disinformation campaigns. And I'm going to talk about these in the context that I've been studying them, which is online, during crisis events, and political disruption. So disinformation campaigns are organized communicative activities that aim to reach large groups of people. Like, it's not that different from other information campaigns, like advertising campaigns, but the term disinformation tends to carry pejorative or negative connotations. To help us understand why, we can contrast it with the term misinformation. Misinformation refers to information that can be unintentionally misleading. Things like rumors and gossip, which emerge from natural human behaviors and have a function in our societies. What do I mean by that? Well, you know, crisis events and disasters, crisis events like, you know, natural disasters, terrorist attacks, and emergent pandemics are usually times of high uncertainty about what's happening and what we should do about it. And in these cases, there are lots of things we just don't know yet, right? And the facts of the situation are quite dynamic. In other words, they change as new information forces us to update our understanding of what's going on. And this uncertainty feeds anxiety about the personal and collective impacts of the event, you know, and what actions we should be taking. So questions like, what should we do? Should we travel? Should we go to work? Should we visit our parents or grandparents? When information is uncertain and anxiety is high, the natural response for people is just to try to resolve that uncertainty and anxiety. And to do that, you know, we gather information and try to piece together an understanding, right? Often coming up with and sharing our own theories of the causes, impacts, and best strategies for responding to whatever disaster we're talking about. And researchers, you know, going back over 60 years, have been, you know, consider this process a natural process, which humans do to, you know, in the wake of disasters. And they think that it has informational and psychological benefits. So with COVID-19, for instance, you know, I imagine most of us are engaging in some form of this process right now. However, this process can also produce rumors, right? Which can turn out to be true or false. False rumors or misinformation are dangerous because they can cause people to make the wrong decisions, including decisions that endanger themselves or others. Now, historically, going back 20 years ago, for instance, the biggest challenge for communities experiencing a crisis event was often a lack of information, especially information from official sources. But with social media now in the equation, the problem isn't a lack of information, but an overabundance of information. And the challenge of figuring out which information we should trust and which information we shouldn't trust. This brings us back to disinformation, which often refers to information that's deliberately false or misleading, such as hoaxes. So the difference seems to be one of intent, but actually it's not that simple. You know, for starters, we don't always problematize deception, right? Since it can be used for benevolent aims, like lying about a surprise birthday party. But colloquially, we associate disinformation with malicious intent. And one cultural reason for this might be that the term has historical connections. to what Soviet intelligence in the 1950s called Disinformation, which is a kind of information campaign based on techniques that go beyond just simple deception. Because of their secretive nature, there isn't a lot of academic or research on these techniques. My understanding is informed by the writings of Ladislav Bittman, a Czech intelligence officer who was a practitioner of disinformation and who defected to the US in 1968, eventually becoming a professor of disinformation studies. His work helps constrain the idea of disinformation to coordinated efforts that seek to manipulate information spaces to achieve strategic political objectives. And this constraint begins to bracket out things like advertising. That said, I don't think we have to rely on the word of ex-intelligence professionals anymore, right? While social media platforms do facilitate new forms of disinformation, they're also providing new ways for us to study them. The activities occurring on these platforms leave behind digital traces, right? Like tweets and videos and posts and comments and likes, which I can use to study disinformation campaigns after the fact and at scale. I also want to just really quickly note that not all disinformation, historical or modern, is connected to Russia, right? This is a topic with global dimensions. The map I'm showing here shows the results of a 2018 inventory. Researchers found evidence of government and military teams engaged in social media manipulation in 48 countries, up from 28 the year prior. And how we choose to respond to such developments has important ramifications, right? Countries like Saudi Arabia and Singapore are pushing for tighter controls over media content. And here in the US, we see educators moving to develop courses like calling BS at the University of Washington, and controversial efforts by tech companies like Facebook to flag fake news. And nobody seems entirely happy with these solutions. Oops, I got a check mark there, which isn't supposed to be there. Oh, good. Point being, nobody's entirely happy with these solutions, which is where those misconceptions about disinformation come in. Now, usually at this point, I dive into some of my specific projects with data and graphs to, and so on to illustrate these misconceptions that I'm going to talk about. But in the interest of giving you all time for questions today, I'm going to run through them at a fairly high level. All right, so perhaps the most common misconception about disinformation is that it's simply false information. If it were, platforms could simply add true and false labels, right? A tactic that's often been suggested. But coordinated efforts to mislead people often actually layer true information with false, right? An accurate fact set in a misleading context, or a real photograph that's purposefully mislabeled. So the key is not to determine the truth of a specific post or tweet or video, but to actually understand how it fits into a larger campaign. The second misconception is that disinformation stems mainly from agents producing false content, like paid trolls or automated accounts, like bots. But effective disinformation campaigns actually involve diverse participants, including journalists, think tanks, information activists, and ordinary citizens who are unaware of their role, but who amplify and embellish messages, the messages of a disinformation campaign. And this matters because an approach that's being used to tackle disinformation campaigns targets criteria like authenticity, which can be defined as whether a social media account is who it pretends to be, and whether it really believes the content that it's sharing. But this only works if you think disinformation campaigns transmit, misleading stuff using people who are somehow in on the game, as it were, right? Who get it. But manipulating people into unknowingly spreading misleading information is a strategy that goes back decades. For example, according to Bittman, who I mentioned earlier, manipulating journalists was a primary tactic during the Cold War. So, and now social media platforms have given voice to a range of new influencers, right? And expanded the range of targets that you can have for manipulation. Another misconception is that the messages being promoted by a campaign are the same as its goals. My research shows that the specific messages can matter less than we assume. One goal disinformation campaigns can have isn't actually about convincing people of anything so much as it is about sowing division and doubt about science and mainstream journalism. And this allows them to take away people's agency and undermine democratic processes, right? Like if nobody's trusting, everyone's divided and nobody knows what to trust, then people cannot organize to act in their own self-interest, basically. And this misconception is interesting because we often think that disinformation is just about what's true or false, but in fact, it's also about tapping into deep social fractures, right? It's sometimes just about getting people riled up and yelling at each other. And perhaps the most dangerous misconception is that disinformation targets only the unsavvy or uneducated, that it only works on other people. My research shows that disinformation campaigns don't just ask people, to unquestioningly buy what they're selling. They can invite audiences to be critical consumers by actively promoting their own methods of assessment when it comes to information. For instance, I've seen disinformation campaigns run events like Fake News Week to, as they see it, inform readers about the deliberate lies told by commercially controlled media. I've seen them draw on sophisticated critiques of institutions and power structures to give their messages more legitimacy. For example, they try to educate readers about propaganda models and about US foreign policy fiascos. And some of these messages can resonate emotionally. Speaking for myself and my students, as researchers engaging with this content, my students and I are often left feeling very disoriented. But the difference comes in where I might accept that, institutions like journalism and academia can be flawed and need improvement. The purveyors of disinformation often invite us to make the radical move, which is to write off these institutions entirely. It's also worth noting that, some of these tactics link to what educators teach sometimes, right? Questioning information sources, doing one's own research, and raising doubts about the incentives of those who are pushing a single message. People are doing that online. Doubt seems to be becoming a tool for these campaigns. So, I think for students and for citizens, addressing disinformation campaigns in the long term is going to require a cultural shift in how we trust others and how we understand our own role in grappling with information, which is to ask ourselves, how do we make wise use of not just our conscious reasoning, but also our emotional and social resources, to evaluate information. All right, so, we've covered some definitions and misconceptions. I'll summarize by saying that, I believe that human flourishing requires contending with how our tools can facilitate the spread of misleading information, and that contending with misleading information will require maneuvering around technology, policy, and education in ways that don't just reaffirm existing arrangements, but also reimagine them. And my work is about helping us understand how we can stay aware, constructive, and flexible as we grapple with these entanglements together. And I can keep talking about that, but if I do, we won't have time for questions. And, so I'm gonna just pause here and thank you for your attention and do my best to answer some now. Yeah.
That was really great. Thanks for that. Was a really nice overview. We've been wrestling with that, and this morning we talked about how, we have the press come here, and on a middle school trip we went to the Tampa Times a couple years ago and checked in with her, and it's a real struggle within the industry to feel like they've been calling into doubt their own work, especially under the pandemic conditions where advertising is down and people have been let go. It's just. So I want to remind you guys for questions, what you want to do is you want to use your participants button and form a queue. And then you're going to unmute yourself and turn your video on and ask your question. And then wait for the response. And then we'll go from there. All right, so calling for the questions, press your buttons. Here we go. All right, Noah Rukwa, you're up first. Well, I think that's Noah Stakeoff, sorry.
Do I get to read the question off, or will you read it off?
Hi.
Oh, they're gonna present them to you themselves, yep.
Oh, excellent.
Hi, thank you for being here.
Hey, Noah, you're welcome.
So I know that people have been trying to turn a profit from this. One such instance was someone claiming to someone selling toothpaste as a way to fight off the virus. How often do you see this false advertising?
How often? So it's hard to quantify that, right? Because I don't have access to all the conversations that are happening on social media, but I can say we see it quite a bit in the wake. So it goes back. It's not new, is what I would tell you, and that it's been increasing in prevalence as more and more people understand and get in on the game. So, for instance, we've seen, my colleagues have been, were studying the Boston Marathon bombings back in 2013. And, there was a rumor that spread around the bombings of the Boston Marathon, during the bombings, that there was a young girl who was injured, who was like, I think 13, who was running in the marathon and who got injured because of an explosion. And then people set up charities to, help support this person and so on. Except the problem is 13-year-olds aren't allowed to run in the Boston Marathon, right? So even back then we have those, this kind of scamming and behavior that goes on. And of course, even before the internet, you have snake oil salesmen trying to take advantage of this. But I think it's increasing in sophistication and prevalence as more and more people turn to social media as a source of, information during disasters.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Noah. Liam, you're next for your question.
Have you ever noticed a pattern in certain posts that are fake that would help you know that other posts similar to it are fake?
Yeah, so what I hear you asking is there a way to, automatically detect misleading information? Is that right?
Right.
So yes and no, right? Sometimes if it's information that's being amplified by bots, so if the people who are spreading the misleading information are using automated tools themselves, sometimes you can find like very obvious or suspicious patterns, like they're all using the same hashtag or they're all posting at the exact same time. But, and those kinds of techniques have been used in the past to identify, for instance, misleading information from Russian accounts. But the trick is the moment you figure out one way of doing it and you catch them, they change it. Right? So it's a constant arms race where they're, you come up with one way and then because there are humans on the other side of the thing planning this, they change how it's done. So there's no one silver bullet, unfortunately, no one way to catch all misleading information. Does that make sense? And then sometimes it's like, as I was mentioning, it's about, because each story and each case is so different, it's hard to just isolate it. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, Reagan, your question is next.
I was wondering, have there been actual proven cures or like things to help besides an upcoming vaccine or anything like that?
So I'm not a medical specialist, So I don't know, actually. I can't, I don't have a medical opinion on these things. All I can just being an ordinary person, I can just share that people are working on it. There are some medicines which are supposed to reduce the, certain symptoms, but they're all being worked on. And the way science works is a bit slow usually, right? Because we want to get it right. But that's all I know. I'm not an expert on that, sorry.
Thank you, Reagan. Kessler, you're up next.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate it. So I actually have 2 questions. So do you want me to read my first or read both of them?
Fire off both.
Okay, so my first one is for regulators of, making sure we're informing the public. How do you draw that line of maintaining First Amendment rights to say what you want and post what you want, and also making sure for the well-being of the public we're not spreading false misinformation? That's a really gray line to me.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on that? And then my second question is, since the 2016 interference in the United States election, has there been more interest in research into what you do as a job? Has there been an uptick since the Mueller report and since we've proven this kind of stuff happens?
Yeah, great questions. So I'll start with the second one real quick. Yes, there's been a huge uptick. When I started doing this work back in 2014, it was a fairly niche topic. Not many people cared about it, to be very honest. And post 2016, there's been a sea-level change in interest, right? I'm getting invited to talks. There are newspaper articles and all of this. So yes, there's been a change in the level of interest around this topic. The amount of money and resources being poured into researching this topic, totally different from what it was when I started. I could have never predicted this when I started my PhD, never in a million years, right? So that's there, and I'd be happy to talk more about that. And the implications of that. It's not necessarily just a positive thing. It's complicated because now scholars from a lot of different disciplines are converging to do work on this space, and that's a good thing. But it's also a little confusing sometimes, where it's oh wow. So there's that. As for the question about regulation, see, now that's why I think you're right to feel that is a gray area, because it is a gray area. It's a very gray area. It's a very complicated and fraught space. It's why, for instance, initially social media companies didn't want to have anything to do with this, because it's not just about, think about it, it's not just First Amendment rights here in the US. These are global platforms, right? They have to figure out what free speech and what these lines are for Pakistan or India. And it's really complicated and fraught. And so I think there are a couple of pieces there. One is, I think these companies and regulators have to own their values. They have to take a stand, okay, and be very careful, because the argument for First Amendment rights or free speech is both a side of authentic and genuine concern, but it's also a side of intentional manipulation, where people are just saying, oh yeah, I have those rights, so I get to say whatever I want and mislead people, right? It's become a site of intentional manipulation by organized disinformation campaigns, frankly. And so there is, I think what you're asking is a question which everyone's asking right now, from legal scholars and philosophers to computer scientists. And there are lots of angles and perspectives in on it. My perspective is that, and this is speaking personally, right, is that, so at the end of the day, we collectively as a society, but also these platforms, the companies that run them, they claim to uphold certain values and they have to own them. And that means accepting that there's no politically neutral way to handle this. Basically, you're gonna have to take a stand and pick sides sometimes and just say, nope, sorry. And companies are gonna have to figure that out. And I can say way more, but I wanna give other people time for questions. So. But good question, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Ms. Corbin, your question, please.
There we go. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate this. So my question is, there is so much misinformation and disinformation, and as you know, a PhD candidate in this field, my question for you is like, where do we get the reliable information to be the most informed that we can be, and to be making the best decisions for ourselves when we're asking ourselves, like, is this true? Is this not true? Is this something I should believe? Is this something I shouldn't believe? Like, what is your recommendation for us, for like, where do we look to find out, like, where do we find things that we can believe, and we can put some you know, we can put faith in the information that we're finding?
Who do we trust?
Who do we trust? Yeah, exactly.
See, so that's again a very good question. And you know, I'm going to step back from it for just a moment before I'll preface what I think it's a very personal question, actually, right? It's deeply personal. Our information diets, like what we decide to consume and put into our minds, is not something which is, I can offer some advice, but it's always like, it's like we as people, like, we hate getting told what to do, what to eat, how to behave, right? So I really recognize and respect that on some level, where it's like, I think what's very important is for people to engage in reflection, carefully reflect and contemplate what works for them and what is healthy, and come to their own understandings is something that I promote. So I teach classes on this, and the material I teach is actually, how do we, engage in a process of self-reflection around our media consumption habits, right? Because the misinformation and disinformation, it's not just, social media is just one stream of our media consumption. There's the television, there's, word of mouth, there are all these things in our information environment. So just taking time to mindfully reflect and notice your own fault lines is, I think, the first step. That's my actual genuine answer. But then beyond that, if you want a quick one, it remains firmly in the camp of trusting the experts, trusting experts. Now, experts can get things wrong, right? They get things wrong all the time. By experts, I mean, scholars and scientists, but also journalists. Now, the journalism industry has faced incredible disruptions because of, changes in technology and advertising models, and they're learning to adapt. But expert journalists, local journalism, and well-vetted journalism remains our best safeguard against this, against the spread of misleading information. So I would say, making sure you have, like, if you're during a disaster or an emergent pandemic, having a closely curated set of accounts, social media accounts that consist of academics and journalists and scholars, giving you their viewpoints would be one of the more useful ways to navigate something like the COVID-19 crisis. And we can talk more about that. I'd be happy to say more. That's just, again, the short Cliff's Notes version there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Ms. Corbin's question sort of provides a synopsis for what we're trying to provide as guidance for our students, because this is an issue.
Mm-hmm.
And we watch the news every day when we're in school, and even out school, we watch a 10-minute CNN 10 program, and then we curate and look at different stories about different aspects of the pandemic. But, we read a couple pieces that involved Professor Starbird,
mm-hmm.
And I explained to the students that I tried reaching out to her, and she actually got back to me, even though she's so busy.
Mhm.
And like, oh my gosh, you have no idea how swamped I am now because of the pandemic. But so that was, mainline organizations going to find experts at universities and bringing them back to the general public, which led to your kind agreement to come and speak to us because we're interested, like Ms. Corbin. She's speaking for all of us and trying to come up with, guidelines for how to go forward. So thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, it is about, I think one of the challenges has been historically that people have felt a bit more alienated from, both how the news and knowledge is produced inside academia, and actions like this where, we're bringing back the knowledge and talking about how it's constructed, the labor that goes into it, how it's a messy, messy process, yes, is a way of demystifying and owning certain things and, repairing certain bridges and building trust, I think, is at the heart of this work. And it's not just, as I said, it's not just rational, conscious work, it's emotional work on some level. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, it's interesting how we tend to go in waves, and now maybe we're moving back to a point where we're really looking for experts. And when you were recounting that story in the beginning about, well, when I got into this program, it wasn't this way. And, I was sharing your excitement about your move to Austin and UT and how exciting it must be to know that your work's valued and it's going to continue to remain that way. So that's really neat.
Thank you.
Pi Dosberg, you're up next with a question.
Hi, thanks for coming. What do you think countries' responses should be to disinformation campaigns led in other countries with the intention of like sowing anger or phobia against that country?
That's a good question, Pi. I would say there are a couple of angles there. Again, this is so. I want to caveat again what I'm saying. I'm not the expert on international relations or political science. So there are people with much better thoughts on this than me. I can share what I've heard a little bit. Like there are different perspectives. I think people are figuring this out. One is, I think there need to be changes to international law. Frankly, right now there's no regulation internationally around. So I'll give you a concrete example. Right now, the Geneva Convention prohibits, aggression against non-combatants, like rescue operations and the Red Cross and these kinds of humanitarian organizations. Okay, but the Geneva Convention has no stipulations about keeping these organizations safe in online settings. So you can't shoot at them, but you can tweet all you want about them and say all kinds of things to legitimize violence against them. And we've seen some of that happen in the context of the Syrian civil war. That's why I bring this example up. And so one of the first steps is to actually just, first of all, like put some laws into place collectively that, problematize some of these behaviors. Right now, we haven't done, no one's done that quite well yet. And, past that, again, I know that, some countries are like, and I think including the US, are considering like, essentially deterrence. They're engaging in policies of deterrence that if you do this to us, we will do it back to you, kind of like a new arms race, if you will. I think there are some real problems with that approach, which is why I'm an advocate for like, more global cooperation around these issues. And also, I think at the end of the day, we have to recognize that these things are happening over like commercially controlled platforms. I think platforms are the ones which will need to step up their game in regulating and monitoring and handling these things. Does that answer your question? I don't know if I got the heart of it.
Yeah, thank you.
Good, we've had a very nice series of questions, so perhaps some of you have had a chance to think about them. And we have time for a few more, so pop those hands up and we'll see if we can get you some answers.
Yeah, they can even be about clarifying something I said earlier in the talk. Like, I think I went through the misconceptions really fast, overall. Normally I attach a lot of data to these things, but you know, I was like, who needs that right now? For
I'm gonna let you riff if you'd like while we wait.
sure. I can riff. You know, yeah, I mean, I think we're all collectively figuring out who or what to trust, but I think what remains, part of what I wanted to get at was slowing down. I think it's important to recognize that this is the rate of information consumption is pretty unprecedented right now. These days, when a disaster happens, we're immediately on social media trying to get the latest news and latest updates. And in my research, I've seen that can be helpful in decision making, but also that it can cause a lot of stress in people. Because now we're all emotionally proximate to every disaster that's happening in the world, it seems. And so sometimes, like when I've interviewed people about their best practices, what I found is over and over again, taking time to slow down and pause and reflect and being like, do I need to know this? Do I need to, if I read something and I get triggered, do I need to react right now or hit that retweet button or that like or the thumbs down button? Oh, I see a hand, by the way, waving. Do I? Yes, I think I did.
Hatch, does that mean you have a question?
Sorry.
It's okay. You know, that's a practical sort of an internal dialogue debate that you're having with yourself, because I think with the students, we worry the same too. Like Twitter is incredible for getting quick insights to something that happened right now.
Mm-hmm.
But we ask our upper school students to subscribe to The Week magazine, which basically then, you know, it's running 5 to 6 days behind what's happening, but it's allowed events to settle a little bit.
Yeah.
Not knee-jerk responding to everything. And so you're still getting your news and you're rewarded for being informed and getting perspectives, but that, you know, first couple minutes mistakes that happen, that tends to be avoided a little bit.
Absolutely. Like good journalism simply takes time. And and also you need time to sometimes monitor your own reactions, right? When we're acting out of anger or fear or hate, those are strong, hot emotions, and it takes time for things to cool off. Just giving oneself time is often, I think if we all collectively did that a bit more, a lot of these issues that we're seeing, some of the toxicities we're seeing in online spaces would go down. But the technologies are designed, so I mean, my background's in human-computer interaction, right? I can tell you these technologies are designed to promote that quick engagement, that rapid, fast thinking, that being in the zone. Like, think about the design of Twitter's endless scrolling, right? It never stops, it just keeps on going. When I worked at Facebook briefly, I saw like on everyone's desk, there was this one book. It was called Hooked. And I don't know if you guys know about this, but Hooked is a book which is about applying the insights of psychology very much and making your product addictive. Like that's how they think about it inside Facebook. How do we get people addicted? It's true. And so the technologies have certain affordances, right? They're designed in a certain way to promote certain behaviors. And now collectively we're realizing, okay, maybe that's not the right thing to optimize for. One can hope change happens. Yeah, that's just me riffing.
Hi, so I kind of have a follow-up. So like with the more interest that there is now up after the interference, like what are the best ways for us to work on that, like with congressional funding and things like that? Like what are the best ways to use our resources to like kind of fight against that and ensure it doesn't happen again?
So who's we in this story?
That's a really good question. I guess it would be like the federal government or,
Hmm. You know, I mean, I'll take that. I think there are several ways, right? I'll just break it down a little bit. I think we, as in, you know, as I mentioned, I'll tackle this from several angles before I get to the federal government. I think we, as in social media companies, you know, as I mentioned, need to take a stand on their values and really invest in designing around solutions to this problem. But they're not actually us, right? No, like, let's leave them aside. Then there's we as in citizens and educators. I've spoken a little bit about, you know, how we can, you know, slow down, cultivate new media practices, and adapt older ones to the new context. And then for the federal government, well, I mean, again, I don't know, but if I had all the power, right, in this imaginary situation, I would definitely work to I would invest in updating certain laws around advertising, what is and is not legally allowed. Right now, a lot of this is just being done by platforms by themselves. There needs to be a push at the government level. There needs to be more funding allocated just to research and improving journalism, frankly. These are large, you know, large issue, like the spread of misleading information is not something that can be solved with one intervention. It needs concurrent work in several areas. I think it needs work. You need to invest more in education. You need to invest more in journalism and in research, and you need to regulate social media more. That's my very high level, off the cuff response. What do you think?
I definitely think, as you said, like a coordinated effort would probably heed more success, and updating laws as well. Like, we don't really have, this 2016 kind of caught us off guard and we weren't really prepared for what happened. And in the aftermath of that, I think, you know, we've kind of stalled our response, in certain ways. And so I definitely think streamlining things and cooperation would be a big deal, especially among all countries as well, not just our own.
Mm-hmm. I agree, Kessler. It's just, you know, part of it is also what's realistically likely to happen, right? So, I mean, I'm curious if you think some of these changes are even possible.
I doubt half of them are possible. It would be, if the government pulled off maybe 2 of these, it would be impressive.
Yeah, and you know, and this brings me back to the question of who's we, right? Which is the question of, like, sometimes I ask myself, what can I do? It is a much more manageable question for me, which is how can I, you know, for me, this is a problem like, you know, a problem on the scale of climate change, essentially, by which I mean that it's, you know, caused by lots of different things. And I cannot wait for the world to necessarily, you know, it'd be nice, but what can I do today, kind of, to be a more informed citizen, or, you know, pick up the litter in the information environment? I think a good place to often start is just the question of what can I do? And that can be, you know, seeking a certain kind of education, making certain kinds of interventions in online spaces. You know, for instance, I think many of us are struggling to figure out how to correct misinformation and disinformation when we see it online, when we see a relative or a friend post something that's questionable. How can we approach that conversation in a way that's constructive rather than destructive, if you will? I think those are the questions we should be asking ourselves individually and cultivating these practices. And then I think we will eventually find ourselves in building technologies to support those practices. But until those practices exist, it's hard to build technologies to support them or find a silver bullet on high to save us. Again, I'm just riffing.
That, you know, in the period of the pandemic, that what you just said about speaking up a little bit is interesting, because, you know, there's been periodic articles about, so anxious, nervous Americans, how do you tell someone if they're not social distancing enough for you? Or what do you say if they're not wearing a mask when you think they should? And, you know, how do we learn? Because if anything, the pandemic's made people more conservative. And I say that in the sense of, holding back and being, reticent about certain things. So I don't know if you had anything to share in that regard about sort of speaking up and banding together with people and, being a community.
I think the pandemic has exacerbated certain divides and divisions and stoked anger. Actually, it's highlighting how, again, I just want to emphasize, mis and disinformation are not just about the facts or the information. They're about, tribalism. It's about tribalism. It's about, how do I put this? So, okay. I don't have very pinpoint thoughts specifically about the pandemic, but I have deep personal thoughts about I have coming from Pakistan. I mean, I alluded to this early in the brief talk that I gave, which is I'm really familiar with this challenge of trying to correct misperceptions, where you can try to argue by bringing all the facts you have to bear on a problem, right? You see someone doing something wrong or preaching something that's problematic or hateful, and you can be like, no, you're wrong. Here's all the facts and reasons why you're wrong. And you might think you win the battle, but in my experience, you end up losing the war. The person ends up shutting down. They don't listen to you. And for me, that triggered a lot of angst when I was in college. Because I was like, what's the point of all this knowledge and all this research if I can't even use it to convince one person who I have a close relationship? What's the point? I became quite jaded, actually, if I'm very, very honest. And so I've spent a lot of time researching and considering, well, what does this mean? Where does this come from? What's this resistance, if you will, and what's a constructive way to engage with it? And I want to check with you, Jason. Am I making sense here to you? So I think some of that, if I am, I think some of that is relevant to what we're seeing now, where there's this, the act of wearing a mask or something, even that is now becoming politicized and a sign of which tribe you belong to, if you will. And addressing some of those things is not possible until we, first of all, move past the notion that it's about facts. It's, facts play a small role in this. What's deeper at play is emotion and the desire to protect one's self-esteem. When you go up and tell someone they're wrong, right, what you're doing is you're kind of pricking their self-esteem a little bit, right? It hurts, it's uncomfortable. And self-esteem is how, it's very important. Self-esteem is so important to humans. The dignity, it's more, a lot of research suggests it's more, the threat of being humiliated is more, drives people more crazy than the threat of death, actually. There's a lot of research that suggests that. And so what I teach in my classes is actually how can we correct misinformation using nonviolent communication, which is a framework for communication that's about emotions and needs. But I mean, that's just one way into it. But I think a lot of promising work is being done around, there's this idea of dialogue journalism, where it's journalism to bridge divides. There's work being done around, I think that's going to be the key piece of research and work, I think, on the ground, which is building these nonviolent communication communities around mis and disinformation. Because even with mis and disinformation, there's no actual, I gave you some examples, but it's very subjective, a lot of it at the end of the day. Does that make sense? So until we learn how to have these dialogues, it's going to be a problem.
The most powerful thing you just did was something that we value here at schools. We talk about where we've come from on our journey and how we've screwed up and stumbled. And, we've just met you, but you willingly shared this. And here you are. You're about to come, move to Texas. You'd be a professor. Some people never encounter people, in academia, and they find themselves intimidating. Sharing that story that, you have knowledge and you've learned things, but also you've got some your own angst and things that you've struggled with on your way. I think it's a powerful lesson. It has nothing to do with the content that you just shared with us. So I want to thank you for that. And I don't think I'm pushing it to say that if someone has a question later, that you're the kind of person that you would, they could email you and you'd respond back to them. You'd say,
Of course.
talk.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. If you have any questions, please feel free to ping me. We can chat. And
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah.
We got one more question, and then we're gonna and then end it. And we just are very grateful. But Pi, one more.
Hi. What do you think about edited videos and like deepfakes? That they like seem so real, it's like almost hard to believe that they couldn't be real, and like fighting those.
Yeah. I think that they represent one. So I have a lot of different thoughts. The one that's coming up for me right now is that, in a lot of debates and conversations that I have, with policy people, with tech people, and so on, is this dream, this desire that we can solve this problem through technology, that we can address mis and disinformation just by building a better technology. And we yearn for like a technology to do away with our social troubles. But here is an example of why that's not likely to happen. I hope we can, but I don't think technology alone. I think it's a very important part of this story, but it's not the only piece, right? Which is if we manage to build a technology to identify misleading information on Twitter, the example you just gave of deepfakes is the next step. It's an arms race. It's never going to stop, actually. That's the thought that comes up for me, where it's like, okay, now you have technologies to make, more complicated, like, fake video content. We have, when I teach some of the stuff I do about, media literacy and stuff, like, I thought it would be about Facebook and Twitter, but, the people I teach, they're on TikTok and Instagram. They don't even use Facebook anymore. So what I'm saying is that, there's this moving target, and deepfakes points to that moving target. And that's why I think both law, like the legal realm, and the realm of technology tends to lag behind what's actually happening. It takes time for like these systems to catch up to what's actually going on. So we might have laws for, bad tweets or bad advertising content, a year from now if we're lucky, right? Like this just, in a pretend world. But then deepfakes will be the next big threat. And you're right, it's already taking off. Of course, countries which have much more resources invested in social media manipulation, like Russia, are already investing in and using these things and experimenting with how to promote them. I think it's going to create a lot of new and interesting challenges. And researchers are looking into this stuff. Audio visual manipulation. And for me, it goes back to, at the moment, on an individual basis, the best thing we can work on is trusting experts, being willing to slow down our information consumption a little bit from what it's become. And yeah, I do worry about that, if I'm honest. I think I'm going to, that's one of the things I'm going to personally study and do research on in the coming months, actually. So it's also exciting, if you will, in the sense that it's like, oh, it's more work. I think there are lots of good questions in that area, is what I'm getting at. It's a site of a lot of questions for all of us, including researchers.
Pi, you had something else?
Yeah, I always wanted to ask about, what do you think about disinformation under like authoritarian regimes, and what kind of legacy they can leave even after like the regime has fallen?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah. What do you think about disinformation like under authoritarian regimes, where they're able to propagate like propaganda, basically, for themselves and against their enemies? And what kind of like legacy do you think that disinformation can leave on that country?
So I think there are a number of pieces there. What's coming to mind for me is, one, people who, just speaking for myself as someone who, I don't think Pakistan is an authoritarian regime, but there, it's a place that, as I say, has deeply dysfunction. It has had military dictatorships for most of my life, and it has a deeply dysfunctional relationship with academia and journalism and all these things. I think what actually tends to happen is people engage in a lot more conspiracy theorizing. Actually, the legacy of that is that people essentially stop paying as much attention to what's in the newspaper and traditional information intermediaries, and instead just engage in a lot more like of their own, just through conversations and in verbal discussions. They just theorize about what's going on in the world by themselves, and coming up with all kinds of narratives, frankly, ranging from the Jews did it to the Muslims did it to so-and-so insert ethnic group or different group here did it. And it can be really problematic for the implementation of progressive policies, let's just put it like that, and can do lasting damage, as you said, long after a particular regime is gone, long after. Sometimes the effects of disinformation cannot be seen until 10, 20 years later, frankly. And so just to give you forget authoritarian regimes, I'll give you a more straightforward example, which might be more relatable here in the US. A lot of the anti-vaccination stuff of which we're seeing is actually tied to disinformation related to the, back during the Cold War, Russia engaged in a lot of disinformation around the AIDS virus being an American conspiracy. And a lot of anti-vaccination stuff can be tied back to some of those early disinformation efforts, if you look into it closely. So, part of I'm not saying the whole anti-vax movement is like, a Russian disinformation plot or something, like that at all. But I'm saying the seeds of some of this stuff are often planted, and we cannot see the effects of it until much, much later. So you're right that there is this emergent quality to disinformation that we just can't see right now.
Thanks, Pi, and everyone for those questions. And it was a really nice way to end with hopefulness and a desire to the excitement of curiosity of doing future research to resolve and look into these problems, and the excitement of an upcoming adventure for you. And we appreciate you sharing your time and your insights with us for this session. It really meant a lot, and hopefully you were able to enjoy yourself too, knowing there's people across the coast interested in what you're doing and wanted to hear what you had to say today. So thank you very much.
You guys asked the best questions, by the way. So, thank you.
All right, well, we're going to turn on our video screens and we're going to say goodbye.